Last week, we took a look at the short story and the elements that make up the short story, right? We talked about plot, conflict, character, setting, etc. And this week, I want to kind of backtrack a little bit on the origins of the short story and the genre that we'll be studying all semester. So, the focus of our entire class is the short story. But what do you think of when you hear the word story? A newspaper, like a cover story, narratives about other people, experiences, ourselves. As people, it's our narrative and story is kind of our go-to vehicle to explain something to someone. I mean, I tell stories all the time to make a point. And stories, when you think about it, narratives are what pull us together. They keep us afloat, if you will. We need to both hear and tell stories to make sense of the world and our place in it. Short stories, then, are nothing more than tales by men and women who've studied the art of telling a story and adapted it to the demands of sophisticated reading rather than listening audiences. However, the genre of the short story is relatively new. It's a baby when we think of literary forms. And the kind of beauty of this genre is that it really does cross generic boundaries and that it takes from all sorts of other genres and combines it into one tightly knitted, limited focus that is also incredibly complex in its simplicity. And the short story is arguably one of the most popular forms of literature. But why? And the answer that I pose to you is that the short story is so popular because it has a universal appeal. It has this connection to traditional forms. It's a continuation of the familiar in that it's it appeals to our need and our drive to hear stories. And it also is popular because it helps us with our reliance on the art of the storyteller, which I'll talk about in just a second. But before the 19th century, the short story was not a distinct literary form. While in this sense it may seem to be a uniquely modern genre, the fact remains that short prose fiction is nearly as old as language itself. Throughout history, humankind has enjoyed various brief narratives like anecdotes, parables, myths, moralizing fairy tales and folk tales, and legends, and uh, none of these by themselves constitute a short story in the way that we define it now. But these short stories evolved and emerged from these kinds of works, these works of origins. And the evolution of the short story began before people could read and write. When you think about these parables or myths or kind of creation stories, they weren't necessarily written down for for thousands of years. How were they told? Well, they were told through the oral tradition. Think about think about this. How do you reach the masses? How do you reach a population? How do you impart your history, your beliefs, your values to people on a grand scale? Well, you do that by telling stories. And you look at the ancient Greeks and people like Aristotle and this idea of oration, right? And the importance of being a good orator or a good speaker or a good teller of stories. That's how you connect to people. But I digress. There's a reason why people still read to their children, why grandparents tell stories of the good old days, or in some cases, the bad old days. These stories are rooted in the oral tradition, communicating information about how cultures define and shape their identity. And at the heart of that oral tradition is the figure of the storyteller. Back in the day, a storyteller was revered in society. I mean, if you look at a culture like the Anglo-Saxons, bards or storytellers were held in the same light as a warrior. They were that important to society because telling stories was a way to keep society, their culture, their traditions alive. And it's a way for people to connect the past to the present. And as keepers of a people's culture, the storyteller that later evolves into what we call the narrator holds a certain level of authority, and with that comes power. And we'll explore this idea later as we move through this semester. But when you tell your own story, when you're there's a certain amount of power that comes with that. But to kind of round out this portion of our lecture, I just want to reiterate that stories and the people who tell them are a powerful force. And this week and next week, we'll examine a variety of works that help derive what we now define as the short story. And this week, we are going to discuss parables, creation stories, and myths. So hang tight with me and we'll talk about each of those a little bit separately.